district was the district of Dennis Hastert, who was the House Majority Leader, and very, very conservative. Anyway, Mr. Foster ran for the finishing of Hastert's term in March. He was elected. Running as a Democrat, as a scientist, and as a businessman. What he's able to do in Congress is just absolutely mind-boggling, because he knows science. I mean, there are a few medical people in Congress. There's 2 other physicists, but their grasp of what's going on in science has been weakened by their long stay in the Congress. Foster is always surrounded by congressmen after a discussion. There was a discussion about the nuclear budget. There were discussions which had to do with directly with science and sometimes indirectly with science. And his authority on this has been awesome. And this reminds me that some 120 years ago, when I was a graduate student, my mentor, his name was I.I. Rabi, probably one of the founders of American science, physics, urged his students. He said, look, he says, go have some fun, get some experiments done, and then run for office. Because power is in the hands of the people who are elected, not the advisors. And he was an advisor. He was an advisor to Eisenhower. And I remember that, and I think it's not an easy thing to do. Not many good scientists are able to cope in a congressional atmosphere. But boy, if we could get 3 or 4 more such scientists in the House and a couple in the Senate, it would change things, because the congressmen really want to do well, often, sometimes, hopefully, and having close advice by an elected person is awesomely powerful.
Absolutely, 100% amen.
Yeah. Would anyone here like to help start a science pack?
We want to start a science pack. Rich people supporting the campaigns of people who care about science, not the science institutions, the rich people.
Yeah, on the last point, I think that you in this country have got a lot to learn from the UK. That our upper house is hereditary, more or less, and is appointed. And we don't have the dual system of one party against another. Of course there is one party there and another party, but we also have crossbenchers who are not aligned with either the government or the opposition. And I think that's the secret for getting scientists who are not taking a party line into positions of government. And I think it's the one good feature of our parliamentary system that I think your Congress lacks.
I just wanted to sort of comment on the historical story and some thoughts. First of all, it's easy to be nostalgic about the Sputnik period, but when I was researching a column, I don't know, about 1.5 years, 2 years ago, about scientists portrayed in literature and popular culture, one of the things I came across was this article in Science in, I believe it was in 1957, but I wouldn't bet my life on it, but somewhere around there, by Margaret Mead and a colleague, and it was about how high school students perceived scientists. And basically nobody wanted to be a scientist because they were weird, but they all said we'd be living in caves if it weren't for scientists. So there was this great appreciation of scientists are wonderful, but they're really odd ducks. They're either working all the time, or they're never working, or they don't have. They were, there was not a sense that everybody should be a scientist. But the longer term, listening to Chris, I was thinking, well, okay, I knew about this Margaret Mead thing, and I knew that even in the 50s and early 60s, when we think about science being very popular, and a lot of people didn't think so highly necessarily of scientists as people. But I was thinking, well, when was science popular? Was it Was it popular in the 19th century? Well, no. I mean, basically, there was this brief time in the 18th century among a certain elite where scientists were popular and science was a great thing. But I also wanted to caution, I mean, there's a great deal of self-congratulation. We're all good liberals, and, I would consider myself on the classical side of that. But, and all the enemies are always conservatives and fundamentalists and people who voted for George Bush. But, conservative fundamentalists did not write Frankenstein. There is also and I'm old enough to remember the backlash against science in the late 60s and early 70s, and it did not primarily come from the right. There's a very deep romantic strain which exists very prominently on the left, and right now they've come together because the romantics can say, technology is bad because it's destroying the planet, and the people who like science can say, well, science is good and it helps us understand why the planet is in danger, and so they're in alliance. But that's not always the case. There is an Enlightenment sort of pro-science point of view that battles not just against religion, but against this very strong romantic strand in Western culture that came out of, was literally a backlash against the Enlightenment and then against industrialization. And I think to leave that out of any sort of intellectual argument, you miss things that are beyond the next 4 years.
I don't disagree with you. If you look at Hollywood, well, the 50s is a different point, but if you look at Hollywood depictions, mad scientists, I mean, obviously they're coming out of that tradition, and this is an issue of two cultures of literary heritage versus scientific heritage clashing in the entertainment industry, and it's not necessarily a right-left kind of thing. I don't mean to suggest that it is. I think that the big enemies politically of science in the last 8 years are clearly coming from the right because the Bush administration was so powerful. Does that mean that it's always going to be that way, that it's been that way in every single country? No. I mean, none of those things are true, but it's presently been the big problem. If we think about the long-term influence of science, we're going to have to take into account a lot of other kinds of political and not political factors, like the complete change in the nature of the media over the last 50 years.
We are running a bit late, so we'll just take one more, maybe. By the way, just to remind you, the romanticism and the dark satanic mills and so on, look at the poster again. It's got Billy Blake all over it. So, Beatrice?
This ties within several of the recent comments. I think that portraying this as a partisan issue is unnecessary, counterproductive, and wrong. It's counterproductive in that it will alienate some of the allies that you need the most and unnecessarily. And it's wrong because I can certainly point to certain domains in which the left has traditionally been hostile to evidence when it goes against their social agendas. In the most recent administration, we have an administration that is particularly strong in terms of its willingness to have potent conflict of interests that tend to align it with the issues that we've talked about today. But I do think it's a dreadful mistake to portray this as a partisan issue.
Will we pick this up this afternoon a little bit later? I think people are getting hungry at this point. We need to recharge our energy sources.